there's infinite ways to educate children, and you have to find the right path for that particular child. And then it's about making whatever we're doing fascinating to them. So it's taking these important things, but packaging them in really beautiful ways. And you can do both things. Let them have a say. Let them have a choice. And if it's a topic that they're not that interested into, well, then make it more interesting. Figure out how do they relate to something and do that.
Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Claire Honeycutt. Claire is a former academic. She spent 20 years working inside of academia and was a professor at Arizona State University from 2015 all the way to May of 2024 when she resigned from her tenured job to become a full-time homeschooling mom. In today's episode, we talk about the things that Claire learned about how we learn from spending 2 decades inside of academia and why she became so interested in intrinsic motivation and self-directed learning. We talk about how she took a mastery-based learning approach inside of classrooms of 50 to 100 kids. We talk about why so many kids in her classrooms struggled with intrinsic motivation and a love of learning, and why she felt so strongly that her own children needed to exhibit a love of learning and that was a thing that she wanted to defend at all costs. We talk about her process of deciding to leave her job to become a homeschooling mom, and we talk about the approach that she's taking to homeschooling her kids and how she's bridging the philosophies of classical education and unschooling to take a very coaching-centric approach to helping her kids love learning and pursue the things that are interesting to them and also get a very robust education. I love Claire's content on Twitter and on her Substack. She does such a great job documenting the journey and the experience of homeschooling her kids, and I hope that you enjoy today's episode. Claire, welcome to the podcast.
It's an honor to be here. I'm so excited.
I'm so excited. We've known each other on Twitter for a very long time, and your content is amazing. You brighten my feed with your little updates about what your kids are up to, what they're reading, what they're working on. I'm so excited to dig into all of that today. I also have to say, just from the top, I think you have the most interesting name of anyone I've had on the show so far. Your last name is so cool. Where is the name Honeycutt from?
I don't know, but when I was a middle schooler, I did not like this name. But as I get older, people are like, "This is the cutest name," and I'm like, "Yeah, you're right. I've embraced it. It's really, really nice." So I don't have any idea where it's from.
It's really pretty and really unusual. I think it's fantastic.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
You have such an interesting story because you spent decades in academia. You were a professor. And you quit your job to homeschool your kids. We have to talk about this.
It's a weird story.
Maybe we start from the top. You were a college professor for 2 decades, 20 years.
Well,
right?
so I worked in academia for 2 decades. I became an assistant professor in 2015 at Arizona State University. So I say I've been working in academia for 2 decades because I was a postdoc for 8 years before that, and then I was a graduate student for a really long time. So I've been in academia for 2 decades, and I've been teaching because you teach as a graduate student, and then I taught actually at professor level classes during my postdoc as well. I was actually where I was first introduced to alternative education was during my postdoc because I got this fellowship because I love teaching. So I got this fellowship, and that's when I learned about student-directed learning and active learning and project-based learning and all of that was during my postdoc. And then I got to apply it. So I've actually only been a professor since, well, not anymore, I guess, but since 2015 until May of this year.
What led you to academia in the first place? Was it a desire to teach, or was it an interest in going deep into a subject area? What was the path that brought you here?
I love science. I was in love with science. And, originally way back when, I wanted to be a medical doctor because I wanted to help people. And then I went to this really cool talk. And I actually would tell my students and the university do this all the time. I said, I went to this talk and it changed my life because it was some person who worked for Medtronic and they were a medical liaison and they were going in between the medical doctors and the engineers. And they were like, we're not going to just do medicine. We're going to make medicine better. And I was like, that that's what I want to do. I want to like make medicine better. And so and the way to do that is to go into graduate school, or at least I thought that was the best way to do it at the time. And so I went into graduate school, and I did very basic science for my undergraduate. I was in a biomedical engineering program at Georgia Tech and Emory. And I actually, so I think you'll appreciate this because you like reading classics. I was raised reading like classic science. So and this is very unusual. Like people don't do this in academia. I made my students do it. But almost nobody does this with graduate students anymore. But we read Sherrington, who was like considered the father of neuroscience. So I read up, my science career was started by reading like ancient science. Anyway, so I just fell in love with science. And that was really the reason why I kept doing things, was science.
But you developed a love of teaching too.
Yes.
You became very interested in the actual process of education. From the outside looking in, it feels like there's a very clear thread in your story of becoming more and more interested in how people learn. Where did that come from?
Well, so I hated school. Everyone says you went to a lot of school, they hate it. And I was like, everyone kept telling me it was going to get better, which I think is a common story. And then I got to graduate school and I got to teach a class in graduate school. And I was like, well, this is kind of fun. And then I started teaching aerobics, of all things, to make money. And I just was like, this is the most fun ever to like get an audience and engage an audience and like get everyone motivated to do something. I just fell in love with it. So when I went to do my postdoc at Northwestern in Chicago, I applied for this fellowship, and they were like, and I was lucky enough to get it. And it's unusual because I don't know how many people know this, but professors actually aren't taught how to teach. They're like, oh, here's some cool science. That's great. Here's a class. Have fun. And so I got this. I had to apply to get money to dedicate time to learn how to teach, but I got to do it. And it was just awesome. Like I didn't know teaching could be as different as it was and as interesting as it is. And it's funny looking back, I think that I probably should have gone to like a college and been at a teaching college instead of going to a university where my predominant job is doing research and not teaching. But, you just do what everyone says you're supposed to do. And it took me a really long time to jump off the path, but I did eventually. But I fell in love with you just getting students excited about things. Like that's where the magic is. That's where the really fun parts are. And that's what I love so much about hanging out with my kids at home is just that lighting, that light. So, yeah.
Learning about the techniques, though, of engaging a classroom, it sounds like this was also a whole journey for you. So you started discovering some of the different components or elements or approaches of a more self-directed learning style. What was the process like of learning how to apply that in a classroom, or saying, wait a second, this is really interesting. I actually want to go down this rabbit hole and master this?
So I was taught all these cool techniques, and I don't know how many people experience like being taught something, or like you watch a YouTube video and you're like, I got this. And then you go do it. It's a disaster. I had a teaching mentor, and he said, no one learns anything the first time you teach but you. And I hope that wasn't entirely true, but I learned so much. I was so lucky because I was doing this in kind of a safe, it didn't affect my job that I could just 100% embrace these kind of, from my perspective, they're brand new kind of, I never seen them done properly techniques and do them in the classroom. And I made so many terrible mistakes that first year, actually the first couple of years, because I taught for several years before I started at ASU. And, but that allowed me when I started ASU to have a really start honing it and start to kind of pull things together. And in terms of like, what was the biggest mistake is that I think that with like the project-based learning or student-based learning, it implies that the students are actually motivated and excited to learn whatever it is you're teaching them. And in a college setting, so many of them aren't. I like working with my children, like almost anything I could be like, let's do this cool project. They're like, this cool project is so awesome. College students can't do that. You're like, let's learn about DNA. And they're like, no, like I don't want to do that right now. And so I could give them these cool projects, but if they aren't bringing the excitement, if they're not intrinsically motivated to do it, then it doesn't matter how much time I spent developing this really cool project. So that's what I had to learn to do, was figure out how do you get them excited about it. And I recognized that I was a lot of that. I had to bring that. I had to create an interesting framework, and I had to do a little bit more, I had to do more direct instruction, but it's direct instruction with a different goal. It wasn't like, I'm going to teach you about these very boring techniques. It's like, let's talk about, for example, we'll talk about neurotransmission. I don't know if you know about neurotransmitters are not that exciting. You're basically having to memorizing all these little neurotransmitters. I think they're cool because I'm in neuroscience. But they're really boring to memorize. And then I was like, well, you know what? These neurotransmitters are turned on a lot when you take mushrooms. So let's talk about psychedelics. And then all of a sudden they were like super fascinating. They're so in. And I'm like, oh, look, now let's talk about dopamine and serotonin and what all these friends are doing. And so how do you create cool, interesting things that get them on board? And then you can talk about the science that's underlying those things. And you can do projects with them, as you should be. But that was a big part of it, that was really hard at the beginning, though, because at the beginning, you're trying all these alternative strategies and no one seems that excited about it. In fact, they kind of seem kind of bored. And you're like, but the projects.
I'm very curious what you noticed about your incoming students as someone who is working with effectively the product of what the K-12 education system is creating, students who are graduates of that system. You mentioned that a lot of kids weren't excited about the things that they were studying coming in, which would feel counterintuitive because they're electing to study this subject. You're not teaching prereq basic English classes or something. You're teaching something that's specialized that kids are choosing to learn about. Why? What did you notice in terms of the levels of enthusiasm and self-direction and intrinsic motivation in the students you were working with?
There's a subset that still have that fire burning, and they're there and they're motivated. I actually remember a homeschool kid who I met towards the end of my career there that was very motivated. But the main thing was, and I would say it got worse. So I taught at the same university. So within the different universities, it's actually quite different. So Northwestern, which is a private school, versus ASU, which is a public school, the way the students were was quite different. The Northwestern students, they were so much more focused on grades, but they were motivated to get really good grades, but they weren't actually motivated or interested in the stuff. And whereas the ASU students they were actually a lot more just interested in the stuff initially. And you have a subpopulation that's very motivated. They have the Barrett Honors College there, and they're very motivated. But what I found, and it got worse, and it got way worse after COVID in particular, that the students, they show up. And I would actually have conversations with students and be like, we have existential crises about why they're there. And I'll just be like, well, why are you here? It's like, well, my dad said I'm supposed to be here. A lot of time it's not them driving. It's just the next thing they're supposed to do. And I think that that's so true for so many of them. It's just the next thing they're supposed to show up and do. And I think they aren't exactly electing it. And, we were in engineering and I was in biomedical engineering. And so I think a lot of students, like a lot of parents are like, be an engineer. Like you're going to make a lot of money being an engineer. And so they'll pick biomedical engineering because it's kind of one of the lighter engineerings, if you will, but they still didn't like it. And they didn't really want to do it. I would also say the other big thing I noticed is increasingly, and this was particularly true after COVID, there was just this kind of malaise that was starting to happen. And the students just, I asked one of them once and I said, why do you think, and I said, the class doesn't feel right to me. And he says, oh, well, COVID happened during our seniors. So we just still have senioritis. Like we just feel like we just don't want to do anything. And you could feel the difference. Actually, COVID, surprisingly, of all the time periods, the students were having a really good time during COVID. Like I was teaching this remote lab and the kids were having a really good time. And even the year after COVID, they were kind of really pumped about being back in the classroom. But then the years after that, you could tell that there was some gaps in the knowledge. And I think that they were having a harder time. I started seeing a lot of deficits in basic grammar and things like this and stuff, experiments that I had been giving students. They're self-directed. We can talk about how I set up the labs in a minute, but the way I set it up and, I give them all the information they need, but they have to kind of design it out. And I have students that I would come around and be like, hey, what's going on? And they would just be sitting there like, I don't even know where to start. Just don't even know. So it's not even like a motivation problem. It's like they don't even know where to start with motivation. They just sit there, like, so there was a lot more of that happening towards the end. I hope it turns around. Not there anymore, but.
Did you feel like it was COVID related? Like there was something that kids had missed from being out of the classroom for a year or more? Or did it feel like it coincided, but there was something else deeper going on that would have taken more gaps than just a year of Zoom school?
I think there was something that, it's a really good question. I'm not 100% sure what happened. What I used to say is that I feel like this big, ginormous thing happened to everybody, and then we were just supposed to pretend like it didn't happen. And I think if you're 40 or 50, it's a short period of your life. But if you're 20, it's a large portion of your memorable life, right? So, I mean, you don't remember a whole lot from like your, K through 5 or whatever, right? So I think it was kind of this big thing. It's a really big emotional kind of trauma, and no one really talked about that. And one of the things I got into towards the end of my career there was actually studying how do we help like students with mental health disorders in the classroom. I don't know if you know this, 50% of American engineering students screen positive for a mental health disorder. So depression or PTSD or clinical levels of anxiety, 50%.
Whoa!
and I redid those tests because we were doing a study, and we got 47 and 52 in the two different studies we did. So 47%.
Wow!
Of our students. This is a ginormous number.
You said it's engineering specific?
Engineering specific.
Wow. Is that higher than the average in other disciplines?
Yes.
Why? What's special about engineering?
I wish I could tell you the answer to that question. I don't know. A lot of people say that it's a much more structured, intense discipline, which I think it is. It's really expected that you, and I also think that there's a lot less hand-holding. It's here's what you need to do, jump through these hoops, get there. And I think that if you aren't incredibly driven, that it's really hard. And if you're having any kind of crises about, is this really what I want to do? Is this really the one? Like I think it just compounds on itself. There was one student that I remember dealing with towards the end, and I remember just sitting with her because she was really struggling. And so I always met with any of this. I would pick out the students that were really struggling, and I would try to meet with them one-on-one. Ironically, like a lot of them wouldn't even email you back. Like I would send a personalized email to like. And that was the other thing, right? After COVID, all of a sudden, I was teaching almost the same material, and almost all, like, I do mastery-based learning in my classroom, which is hard with 50 to 100 students, but we did. And so, like, they could take the exams multiple times. So, like, it was super easy. Like, you could get an A and B in my class if you worked. And all of a sudden, I had, like, a third of my class failing. All of a sudden. And I was like, what's happening? And so I would send these individual emails to students and be like, hey, you are currently failing. How can we figure this out? Do you want to retake the exams? Do you want some special help sessions? And the vast majority of them wouldn't even email me back. But I remember one of the students who did email me back, and we had a long conversation. She was dealing with so much. Like her mother was having problems, and she had a history of mental health disorders herself. And she just felt like she was driven to be there, but just really wasn't in this healthy space to be able to be there. So, and I don't really know exactly. So I became very interested in trying to, how do you create a supportive environment for students like that who really want to be there, but just are struggling.
But it also sounds like there are a large number of students who don't deeply want to be there or don't have an intrinsic reason to be there. It feels like
it's just the next thing.
The right thing to do. Do you feel like some of the lack of interest or even apathy that you were feeling was mostly related to their subject area because they weren't actually really interested in the thing they were just trying to be? Or did it feel more holistic, like they weren't that excited about learning other things either, and it was sort of an overall sense of apathy towards learning something new?
I think it's kind of a combination in the sense that I don't think they know what they're interested in. I don't, like, when you would ask them, like, well, what do you want to do? I'm just thinking about the conversations I've had with some of the students, and, they said, well, I don't know. what do you mean you don't? What are you here spending all this money if you don't have any idea what it is? Like, I don't think they've even had the opportunity to think about what it is that they want to do or what they're interested in. I don't think anyone's actually had a conversation with them. Why do you want to get this specific degree? And I do think that we are not doing a good enough job. It's one of the reasons I homeschool. So I want my children to be able to figure out the things that they enjoy and go deep in those things and try them out before they commit to a college degree. And I've said, and I say this, I was a college professor for all this time, but I'm not going to say the college is not the default for my kids. There's if they choose if they want to be medical doctors, okay, they're going to have to go get a college degree. But if they're going to be writers, oh, well, let's find you a cool writing mentor online. Let's have you take Write a Passage with Dave Perel. Let's, how much, for $25,000, that's 1 year at a public school. Do you know how many cool writing classes I could get or teaching mentors that I could get for my kids who are actually out in the real world making a living, being writers? There's just so many, it will not be the default for my kids. But I don't think current students have any idea what it is that they want, and they've never even thought to think about it.
Do you have a sense of what, I know this is a very big question, but do you have a sense of what the prerequisites should be to go and take the leap into a college program and getting a degree? And I don't mean that in a authoritarian sort of way. You have to check these boxes in order to do it. I mean it in a very personal level. What do you think makes somebody ready to make that decision based on the students you saw who were really bought in and were excited about what they were doing versus everyone you had come through their classroom who thought they were doing the right thing but didn't have any clear vision or motivation, and that caused them to really struggle to push themselves through the motions because deep inside they weren't aligned on why they even wanted the thing?
I think everyone needs to be able to try out what it is that they think they want to do before they do it. And I used to tell my students that all the time. I would say, they're like, oh, I'm going to go get a master's. And I'd be like, why? Why are you getting a master's? And they're like, oh, because I want to get this job. I said, how do you know you like that job? Have you tried that job? Have you worked at an internship? When I was first considering homeschooling, I was listening to a podcast. I think it's called Living Joyfully. It's Unschooling. It's an unschooling podcast. And she interviewed, I was like, how do these unschoolers turn out? So I was listening to all the podcasts of these the grown unschoolers. And she was talking to this one woman. And she said when she was in middle school, she wanted to be a veterinarian. And she was so passionate about it. And her parents were really cool and moved to a place where she could go work with a big animal vet. And she said she did it for a year and was like, I don't want to be a vet. And her mom's like, why don't you want to be a vet now? And she said, I thought I was going to be taking care of cute puppies and stuff, but it's really helping dying animals and sick animals. And I don't want to be around sick animals. And she said, she's like, I probably would have gone to college to be a vet and gone through a bachelor's and then gone to get a veterinary degree. And I would have been 26 or 27 being a vet and been a year in and be like, I don't think I want to be a vet. And I was like, and she completely pivoted and she had started her own business and she had been working in her field for 8 years and she had started her own business after that. So she had was this business owner and she was 26 and I was like, either she could have just been deciding she didn't like being a veterinarian. Instead, she's been working in her field for a decade. And I just, I was like, no, that's, I think everyone should get the opportunity to try. And, with my kids right now, my oldest rather, is most excited about being a writer, which is why I mentioned the writing. And I was like, well, let's start you a Substack. When you're ready to commit to writing something once a month, we'll start you a Substack and we'll start putting your work out there. Then you'll learn to be a writer. Try it. Because you might decide, no, this is not for me, and making a living as a writer is its own challenge. In any case, I think kids need more opportunities to try things and try them before they, follow a doctor around, follow around a veterinarian, whatever it is that you think you want to be. Go be an intern at an engineering company before you go get a master's in engineering and think that that's what you want to do. And I think, I experienced that. I just kind of kept doing the next thing, me jumping off this treadmill. So it feels like I'm this person that's always been really good at that. I'm not. It was really hard to jump off the treadmill, and I always just did the next thing. And I had opportunities along the way. I had really good job offers and I chose to stay in academia. And I had a teaching offer, even though, and I should have taken it in the hindsight, though I'm grateful for what I've learned since then. But I just kept going because it was the next thing that you do. And then I decided, once they couldn't fire me, I got tenure, so I decided to quit. But I think that people need to be able to try. And if you're not able to try what that job looks like, I don't think I would have liked this job if I had been allowed to try it. So I would have liked the teaching part, but I was mostly doing research. And if I'd known that, I probably would have just stuck with the teaching part.
That's an amazing answer. Every high schooler needs to hear what you just said, because nothing in the world tells you that. You go and you take personality assessment quizzes or aptitude tests, and they tell you that your aptitudes lean in a certain direction. So here's a handful of careers that would leverage that aptitude and that you'd probably be good at. And it's extraordinarily shallow and extraordinarily simple, and really doesn't take into account what you like or the specifics of what you're good at. And you're encouraged to spend more time studying and preparing and no time actually working and trying things. And you can go through an entire adolescence and early adulthood without anyone ever telling you to try the thing that you think you want to do. And so much time is wasted preparing for things that turn out to be completely misaligned with what actually makes you happy. And by the time you reach the end of this cycle, you have inordinate amounts of student debt. You've spent time preparing for this thing for so long that you want to go out into the world and do something now. You don't want to go back to school to study something else. You don't want to spend more time preparing. You want to get on with your life. There's a deep sunk cost fallacy that's very much at play. And so it's very easy to stay on the road that you mischose for decades.
Yep.
Because it feels like you have to now. And I wish everybody could hear what you just said, because when you think about it in those terms, it is so simple and it is so empowering. You try something, you see if you like it. If you do, you double down, you try out more things, you find your specific path. And if it doesn't fit, then you go back to the drawing board and you say, okay, what about this didn't I like? I'm going to make sure that the next thing I try doesn't have those elements. And then I'm going to go try something else and see if I like that. Or if not, rinse and repeat and do it again. It's so straightforward, but it's such a deviation from the normal paradigm that it doesn't even occur to you, because nobody tells you you should, or that it's even possible.
Right.
You're supposed to be in class all day, not doing an internship.
Well, that's the other thing. Like, aren't you supposed to, like, if you think about what's the riskiest thing you could do? Take 6 months and go work for free in an internship while you're hanging out with your parents or whatever, or spend $100,000 like on a college degree that you don't necessarily know. I mean, oh my gosh, like, that seems ludicrous that we just default to that. And, I certainly will encourage my children to try out the careers that they'll do, or go work at Praxis if they're still around, and try things out, before they 100% agree.
We have to talk about your journey to becoming a homeschooling mom, because I know this was a process. If I understand correctly from everything I've read, you did not necessarily aspire to be a homeschooling mom from the beginning. Where did the seed get planted?
So COVID, I mean, it's kind of cliche, I guess. We were COVID homeschoolers. I will say, so the history was that, work was going well. And my husband, we had two working parents, though we were not thriving. We were barely surviving. It was really, really hard. And when we were at home, my oldest in particular was having just really age-inappropriate fights, like tears, crying, slamming doors, all of these things. And all kids have those things, but it was every day. It was so intense. We were working with people to try to help with it. And COVID happened. The kids came home from school. And 2 weeks in, I remember turning to my husband and I said, when was the last time she threw a tantrum? And he was like, I don't know. And I was like, well, that's new. And we were left wondering, was it always just school? Because, for me, I mean, she was only 5, but she'd been in daycare since she was 9 months old. So for us, how are we supposed to tell the difference? And sure, they'd been home from school breaks and stuff, But it wasn't like this. It was so different. It was dramatically different. She was laughing and smiling. She was a different child. And it's one of those things, like once your eyes are open to something, you just can't close them again. And so I just spent that whole summer like deep diving this homeschooling thing. I was like, what if my husband was like, what if we taught her at home? I was like, what is that even called? Like, I didn't know any homeschool. I was like, I don't think you can do that. It sounds so crazy now because I'm so entrenched in the homeschooling community. But at the time, like, I didn't know a homeschooler. Like, I guess I kind of heard about it, like, how people talk about it on, like on the TV about how, the crazy homeschoolers over there. And now we're those crazy homeschoolers. But, I just didn't. I didn't even think, I didn't know. And I started the Twitter account because I was trying to meet homeschoolers. It was never an intention, and then, it kind of blew up. But I just was doing that to make friends. Like, I didn't know anybody that was doing this. And then it was COVID, so you weren't going to meet anybody. So I did all the deep dives into the podcast, and I read all the books, and I found Peter Gray. And there was this amazing podcast called School Sucks Show. And I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened to him. Brett, I loved that podcast. I was trying to send it to somebody the other day. I can't find it anymore. But he had hundreds of episodes, and just from anybody, everybody, everywhere. I met, Peter Gray there, and Carrie McDonald, and Isaac Morehouse, and, all of them. And I just did just listen and listen and listen. And I was like, I think I want to do this. And that summer, my husband asked me, he says, what do you want for your 40th birthday? And I said, I want to homeschool my kids. And because it felt like something we couldn't do. It felt like it was just so pie in the sky. I was like, this is a huge thing that I want. And so we put the kids back in school in August. It was terrible because we both had full-time working jobs. I was like, I don't know how to do this. And then I just couldn't take it. And I said, I can't do this. And I said, there's never been a better time to try this because ASU was still mostly remote. Like, I had to go on campus a couple of times, but I was like, we're just going to do it. And if we hate it, we can go back. Like, we could just try it for 6 months. And I knew, I think we both knew, we're like, yeah, we're going to do this. And so I count that we officially started homeschooling January 2021 because I don't know what we were doing in 2020 that was not homeschooling, and I don't count it as homeschooling. We had a great time, but there was not a lot of school involved. So we started then, and I'm in love with it. It was just loved everything about it. It was just so much better. My children were better. Like, everything was better. I was better. I've said this before on Twitter, I think, that I felt healed by my children. Like, I was supposed to be with my children. And this time period that I was away from them, like, part of what was wrong with me, like, yeah, my job was going fine, but like, I wasn't okay and they weren't okay. And I was supposed to be with them and they were supposed to be with me. And we're just so much better. So I loved everything about it. And then it took me another 3 years, I think, to officially decide that I was going to quit my job. And that had a lot to do with, I'm replaceable at work, but I'm not replaceable at home. And I couldn't homeschool them the way I wanted to while working the way I was. And also me and the university were starting to have some disagreements about how education should work. But the main reason was I didn't want to be like, oh, it's 10 o'clock. Like, I kept finding myself like worrying about work instead of being with my kids. Like, I was like this morning, I was 100%, there's nothing, this is what I do. Like, this is what I do. I sit with my kids, and that, if we need to take a little extra time to do math, we're having some drama with our math curriculum right now with my oldest, and it's a thing. And so we needed to have a long conversation about that. And that's just what we did. And I didn't have to worry like, oh, do I have that meeting? Oh, do I need to go? It's just like, this is what we're doing. So that was, and it was torture to quit. It was really, really hard to quit because this is the kind of job, you don't walk away from it and you can't get it back. It's not like, oh, I'm just going to take a 6-month sabbatical. It's, if you leave, you're gone. And I could get back, but it would take me like another decade to get back in. So, but it was torture. It was torture. And then it's such a cliche. Once you make the decision, it was like, oh, I just felt so much better. It was like, oh yeah, this is exactly what I wanted to do. And then this summer, because I officially resigned in May. And so this summer, the last 3 months has just been magic, just to be with my kids and work on them and love them and worry about math curriculum. I mean, like, I don't know anyone else. So like, I have a good time looking at math curriculum. I'm like, what are all the options? Oh, this one's not. So I'm weird.
I've also heard you talk about the desire to see your kids' love of learning and that it wasn't present even when they were small. Can you talk about this too? Because this is really interesting.
So my youngest was had a fairly decent, and she was still 3 when so she will always feel like she was basically homeschooled. And my oldest, like in like the school, like she went to a very sweet little, so that's the other thing. She wasn't in like a public school. She was at this really great traditional Montessori school. I'm in love with Montessori. And I still think it was wonderful. It's nothing about the school. School was great. Had to do with more her. But she would just get really terrified of like making mistakes. And she still does, actually. And so you can't learn without making mistakes. Like that's the whole point. And so she just hated, like they would tell us she doesn't like to read. She won't read anything. And we fixed that pretty quick, actually. But it was trying to get her to just be in an environment where someone could hold her hand and walk her through feeling comfortable with something. So with reading, mostly that was just about getting her excited about stories again. And so I can talk about reading, but like writing is a better example. So she hated writing. Like I couldn't get her, we mostly unschooled those first couple of years, which I think was exactly the right thing to do. Like it's kind of unschooling, deschooling in a way, because she was so used to like when I said, let's do our work, it was just like, no, I don't want to do it. I don't want to, like, I'm not going to sit. I don't want to write anything. I don't want to do anything. And so, but part of it was just because she didn't feel comfortable if it was going to be spelled right or whatever. So we started with, I know you have a love for poetry. We've talked about this. We started with poems, and I would just say, look, if it's a poem, it doesn't have to be capitalized. You can spell it wrong. It doesn't even have to be a sentence. You don't need a period. Like, it's a poetry. Just call it poetry. And so we just started her writing. I was like, I drew a heart. I'm like, just write all the things you love around this heart. We're going to call it a poem. It's called a shape poem. It's about a heart. It's about things you love, right? And I still have it because it was one of the first things she did with writing that she legitimately enjoyed. And she was like, she just wrote all of our cats' names and her family members. And it just, so it was about trying to find, how do I get to her in a way that makes it right for her? And I still believe that. So like I mentioned the math curriculum, she's still, I say online a lot, like if your kid knows math but hates math, you still failed. It doesn't have to be her favorite subject. She doesn't have to like be a mathematician. I don't need that. I need her to not hate math. So we have conversations. What do you not like about this? What are we struggling with? Let's try this other thing. See if this other thing matches you. And so I think it's so much about personalizing education exactly to who they are. And I think, I don't know how you do that outside of like a homeschool environment or a small micro school environment. I don't use the same curriculum. Now my kids are going to be on different curriculums. That's okay. They're different kids. They're different different people. And so I think spending the time to figure out who they are exactly so that I can create curriculum experiences, because I still believe in a very rigorous education. I just don't think it has to be stuffy. I don't think people will say, what is your homeschool method? I'm like, we're somewhere between classical education and unschooling. And they're like, that makes no sense. Like you can't, like those are like the polar opposites of each other. You can't be classically educating them and unschooling them at the same time. And I'm like, yeah, you can. Like you just have to, they have to be on board with it. Like you have to, like unschooling is about figuring out what they're into and helping them craft. So I think you can do both. I think it's possible to do both. My kids enjoy reading classic literature because I help them get there. They're enjoying the like language arts, but we had to push through some things, and pushing through is the wrong term. We coached. When she was upset about something the other day, and I said, oh, she was supposed to write something nonfiction. She loves writing fiction. She had to write something nonfiction. And I was like, what do you not like about it? Is it too boring or is it too hard? It's too boring. Oh, well, why don't you pick something out of the encyclopedia you're excited to write about? I could do that? Yes. Okay. And so then she was off. And then not only that, we came home yesterday. My husband and I went on a date. We came home and they had their computers up. They were like taking notes. Like they are making up new nonfiction things to write about. Like, they're 10 and 7 because that's fun, right? So yeah, so we're classically unschooling. I don't know, but I just, kids can love learning, and I just refuse to believe. I think if your kid hates something, you're doing it wrong. Like just pivot. You got to pivot someplace else. Anyway.
How do you think about the relationship between the classical education and the unschooling? Because I get the I completely understand what you're saying. And I also understand how people have a real knee-jerk reaction to that of like, those aren't the same thing. How do you maintain the values of both in balance? Like, what does it look like in practice?
Well, I think when you think about unschooling, what are the big tenets? And, I know there's the radical unschoolers, which are like letting the kids 100%. I see the unschooling that I kind of think of as more of like a coaching model, but you're still really in tune to what it is that your kid is interested in and helping them find deep depth in that thing or multiple things ideally. I think younger kids in particular, you want to keep them as broad as possible, expose them to as many things as possible, and then you let them kind of get deeper as they get older. So I think that it's about a volunteer choice. It's assuring that the children are still a part of the decision-making process, that they're still engaged. If I sat down, if I talked to my oldest who's struggling with the math curriculum right now, and I said, she's like, I just don't want to do this. He says, okay, well, what do you want to do? Like, let's pick a different one. It's not say you have to learn math. Like, we have to come up with some way. Okay, I'll say it this better way. The first time she did gymnastics, she didn't like it. And I said, this isn't because it's not that you don't like gymnastics. You didn't like that gymnastics teacher. Let's try a different gymnastics place. We went to a different gymnastics place. She fell in love with gymnastics. Now it's like her big thing, right? And so I say the same thing. It's not that you don't like math. You don't like this math teacher, right? Let's find a math. And I just believe that there is many ways to educate children as they are children. Like there's infinite ways to educate children. And you have to find the right path for that particular child. So I do that, and then it's about making whatever we're doing fascinating to them. So my kids love history. I sit and just read them history. We use the story of the world curriculum, but I add to it. And we do all these projects, and we do extra videos, and we do we're building things, and they're going on like voyages while we're reading about the explorers and stuff. So it's taking these important things, but packaging them in really beautiful ways. And you can do both things. In my university classroom, it was the same thing. I was like, well, I let the students pick their project for the semester in the lab. They're like, yeah, but they're not going to be learning all the things. You don't tell me that. I know what the objectives are. They have to learn how to design an experiment, to come up with hypotheses and do all these different things. Why not let them pick what they want to study? It has to be within, there were some safety concerns. Obviously, I said you can't study certain things and stuff, but let them have a say, let them have a choice. And if it's a topic that they're not that interested into, well, then make it more interesting. Figure out how do they relate to something and do that. I don't know if that helped.
Oh, absolutely. What are the elements of classical education that you feel most strongly about bringing into your kids' education experience? Is it, obviously there's a set of values that comes along with that, reading the classics, having a very strong academic foundation. Are there particular things that are bigger points of emphasis for you? Or when you think about the end objective, what is the North Star or the compass that's sort of helping you figure out in the day-to-day while you're tuning into your kids' interests and their innate desires and their innate curiosities, the things that you want to coach them into working on next?
I want them to be independent. And I really mean that. Independent, logical thinkers capable of coming up with their own direction and to have a continual love of learning. And I don't think maybe they exist. I love so many. Maybe Montessori would have gotten there if she'd been able to go past elementary school. But I don't see another model out there that trains the mind as well. It's, you learn history. At the beginning, you're just learning facts and figures, but then you start evaluating that history and understanding that history and why do these different people interact with that way. And the classical model of doing it in order, I'm learning so much history. I was like, why on earth did we teach it this other way? It makes no sense. If you put things in order and then you start to kind of, these people are interacting in this way and this is how these things were going together. And then the logic programs we started, my oldest is just now moving into the logic phase. So we're starting some of the logic programs and stuff like that. And the reading of the classics, the ability to listen and hear the different ways of putting together English language. my children will listen to things because they've been exposed to it more than I have. And we'll listen to things and I'll be like, I'm having a hard time keeping up with this. And I'll be like, do we need to pause this? They're like, no, it's good. I'm like, okay. So classical models train the mind in just an amazing way. I think the biggest problem is that unless you're I know you read all the classics on your own, you're a very motivated, driven student. I think that unless you're that, it can be kind of stuffy and boring. And so I feel that trying to pull those pieces together, you can be a really good writer. Let's write about something, nonfiction or fiction, whatever. Let's write about something that's in your heart, that you're interested in, those kinds of things. But I want them to just to know themselves and to be independent thinkers, and also not necessarily to think the way everyone else thinks. You imitate other thinkers at the beginning, and then you emulate those thinkers. You try to get to those thinkers and then be better than them. So.
Did you know from the beginning that homeschooling was a thing that once you knew you wanted to take the leap, was it a thing that you were like, we're going to do this and we're going to do this the whole way through? Or did it feel like a thing that you were going to experiment with and you weren't sure how it was going to go? And also, how do you feel about it now? Does it feel very definitively that this is a thing you want to do all the way through? Or is it sort of we're going to do this through elementary school and then we'll see how we feel about middle school and then we'll see how we feel about high school?
My husband and I are very risk averse. We say we're very conservative in all the things. We always try it first. So when we first, and actually we did Prinda first, and which I love that company. And my husband actually ended up working for them for a little while. In any case, so we love them, and they're in Mesa. In fact, so I met it on Brett's podcast. I listened to an episode with somebody that were talking about Prinda, and I was like, where's this Prinda place? And it was in Mesa, and we're in Mesa. I was like, they're in Mesa. Anyway, so we did that because I think Prinda, I have so much love in my heart for Prinda because they helped us take that leap. It is so scary to just be we're just going to pull them out and it's all fine. But Prinda was we'll help you. We'll help you with grades and we'll figure out all of these different things for you. And I think a lot of people need that in between stuff. And I know there's so many people that just figured out. I'm so envious of people that just knew their whole time that they wanted to homeschool. I'm oh, why couldn't I have been like you? My whole life would have been different. But alas, but a lot of people who aren't like that and are trying to take this. So we took that kind of in between step, but very quickly I was I love this. And also the unschoolers say that, because people ask them would you ever put your kid back in school? And I say what the unschoolers would say. I'll ask them. And if you ask my kids, and I ask them regularly, do you want to go back to school? No. So if my children said in high school they wanted to go to school, we would have a conversation about why they wanted to go to school. Can we meet those needs outside of the school system? But if we can't, they're going to school. I don't, so yeah. So I'm in. I'm spending a bunch of time looking. I was just looking up science curriculums, and I'm okay, because now 5th grade is serious. When you get into middle school, you got to start thinking about, okay, what curriculum do they have so that they're prepared for the sciences and the math and all of that stuff. So I'm doing all the okay, well, what do I need them to be able to take before they go to, and even though I don't necessarily assume they're going to college, I want them to have the option to go to college. So I want them to have everything they need to go. And it's totally fine if they're nope, that's fine with me. But anyway, so I'm all in. And it's huge yes in all the ways. I will also point out though that because I think that there's not enough people that say this, I second guess a lot. Is this enough? Am I doing enough? Am I doing, because I think a lot of the homeschool people come out and just says, oh, it's all just rainbows and butterflies and unicorns, and we're all just so happy all the time. It's no, it's hard. It's hard. I certainly have moments where I'm am I giving my kids everything they need? How do I work through that? But the benefits and the changes I've seen in them are just so miraculous that I think that will always win. That will always win.
My mom would describe her experience very similarly to what you just said. And I think you're right. It is a really important thing to emphasize, because it's very easy if you don't feel the confidence to feel like there's something missing, and there's really not. People just get very focused on being encouragers of the movement, because the movement needs a lot of them. But the uncertainties, I think in large part kind of inevitable, because it's scary to do something that isn't perfectly prescribed and you have to determine the path, there's a risk that comes with that. Even if it's small, it can feel very large, and that's scary. And you're basically assuming the risk that your kids are going to one day not be able to get the job that they want, go to the school that they want, get into the university that they want because they haven't learned the right things. And that can feel very, very heavy. And it's easily surmountable for the student. If they know how to learn, they can pick up anything they missed. Like it's not as bad as it feels on the worst days, for sure. But it is scary. And my mom I remember she was always very open with my sister and I when we were growing up. And she would say very similar things to what you just said. She'd always tell us that she was trying to make sure that we were learning the things that we needed to know to be able to make the transition to traditional school if we ever needed to. And that we knew the things that we'd need to get into university if we ever decided we wanted to go, so that we weren't being limited by the experience that we were having. But she also would tell us, like, I hope I'm doing this right. I hope I'm covering the things that I need to cover for you guys to grow up and be successful in the world. Like, I hope you're learning what you need to know. And she was open with us about the fact that sometimes was a question mark. And I'm deeply grateful that she was, because it, I think, really helped me understand that a lot of the things in life that feel very fixed and feel like there's a set of rules and the adults just know what they're doing, and someday when you're an adult you'll know too. I think it was actually really formative in my philosophy that things aren't always super clear even to the adults, and that the things that look very solid are in fact quite malleable. And I think it affected my ability to take risks and be really comfortable with it because I watched my family do it. But I think that what you said is really, really important. And I think it's something I'm trying to think. I don't know if I've ever met a homeschool parent that doesn't feel a little bit of that at some point or another. Maybe. I've never heard somebody say, no, I never feel any of that.
Well, I think
it's real.
I think it's hard because you almost have to kind of reinvent what it means to be educated. And that feels so like, what? Who am I to do that? Because you could look at the school, but then you wouldn't be homeschooling if you were like, oh, the school's doing it, right? Like, you know what I mean? So you can be like, okay, well, school says they need AP Bio and AP Physics and Calculus and whatever. And it's like, okay, well, but do they need those things? And why, what conditions do they need those things? And then it's like, well, I have all these other things that I think they should also be doing. And what about their personal interests? And how do we fit all of those things in? And so you're kind of having to rethink. Like, you asked that question earlier, like, what is your goal, your North Star? Like, what is it that you want them to be able to do? And I will say, and I think there's plenty of influencers that talk about this a lot, but in my personal experience with a lot of homeschoolers, I think there's not enough of them having that goal like in mind. They're like, okay, I'm just using this curriculum because someone said it was a good curriculum, instead of saying, who is it that I want my child, or what is it I want my child to know or be able to do when they're 18? And that's going to look very different for different kids. Like, some kids, not all kids are going to be, my kids happen to be fairly academic, which isn't surprising because their parents are very academic. But lots of kids aren't. I have a good friend, and her kids, like, that's not what they're passionate about. They're really passionate about completely different things. And so what is the right path for that child? And for them to leave a really beautiful, wonderful life. Yeah, they're still going to have to know some math, but maybe AP chemistry isn't really what they need to be spending their time on, right? Maybe they could be taking some deep classes in something completely different when they get to there, So, but I think it's important to talk about feelings of inadequacy. And I will also say that I felt underqualified to teach my children, and I say that, I like to say that often, because I was sitting there going, I remember the moment just being like, wait a second. Okay, like, I have a PhD in engineering, and I'm like a published author, like do science for a living, I review for NIH, and I don't feel like I can teach my kid math. Like, I don't feel like I can teach my kid to read. Like, I didn't come up with that idea. That idea somehow came into me. Like, I don't know where that idea came from, but it wasn't my idea. And I always tell people, like, you don't need all of these qualifications. Like, I'm just saying that even if you have everything you could I met a woman once who had a master's in education and felt like she wasn't qualified to teach her kids. I'm like, it doesn't matter how much education you have, you're going to feel like underqualified to teach your kids. And that's okay. Like, you can do it. There's lots of people to help you. And anyway.
One of the things that I think you get very right, though, is the level of prioritization that you put on your kids' love of learning, because that is the underpinning of everything else. And in everything that I've heard you say in the last almost hour that we've been talking, and everything that I've heard you say on Twitter, it feels like it all comes back to this reverence for the child's enthusiasm and the child's curiosity. That's the underlying spirit in so many of the tweets that I see you post that feel so exciting to me. Is you're posting about what your kids are reading, or what they wanted to be studying today, what they chose to study today. And it feels like every time you share something like that, there's this underlying reverence towards the enthusiasm that your child is embodying by having that desire and acting upon it. And it feels like that's such a core piece of how you talk about the students that you taught in university, how you talk about your kids. And I think that's something that if you are emphasizing that, the rest will follow. It's the thing that enables everything else. You can force a child to memorize something, but if they innately are curious, they will be able to infinitely replicate this process of absorbing information. And that's the skill that they need to carry them through a lifetime of learning. And I want to talk about you for a minute, because your story with this is very interesting to me, because you mentioned at the very top of this conversation that you didn't like school. And yet you have this deep passion for learning. You went deep down the rabbit hole on how kids and adults learn. You applied it in your classrooms. You clearly are deeply fascinated by how your children learn. You went down the rabbit hole studying all these different modalities of education. Did you maintain the verve, the love of learning, through your childhood in spite of not liking school? Or is it something that you had to re-find?
It's a good question. I think there was certain topics. Like, I think because I ended up in science, because I always loved science. My mother will tell you that she thought I was going to be, a researcher from the time I was like 6 years old. She tells me we went to the like the science museum, like when I was like a Girl Scout, like the brownies. So I was like really little. And she said that they were like, we're going to dissect the cow's eye. Who wants to do it? She says, all the kids squealed and ran away. And you said, can I touch it? And so like, I was like, she was like, you were going to be a scientist very early on. And so I think I always had a love of science. I think I mostly was bored in school is what I remember. My parents did pull together and put me in a really nice private school. It was a STEM-focused private school because I was really interested in STEM, obviously. And so I did. I think that reignited some of the learning there because they had but I also was kind of overwhelmed because I wasn't fully prepared for like the literature and the history because I wasn't interested in that and I hadn't been taught it very well. I think that the love of learning really has been, I would say most of my love of learning has been since I had to start teaching and I was really in a workplace where I was having to figure out all of the things. And I think there's nothing like being like all of a sudden I had to learn how to run a lab and teach my classes and be a manager, right? Like if you're running a lab, if you're a research professor, you're basically starting your little startup, except for all your money comes from the government. So you had to learn how to write grants and manage all the paperwork and things. And so I think a lot of that was just like learning under fire. And I think that once you fall in love with learning, you can't stop. And I think my interest in learning had more to do with the fact that I didn't like learning in a classroom. And so I didn't want students in my classrooms to be so miserable. I was like, there's got to be a better way to do this. And I just can't put them through what I went through. And so I was all about creating, I learned all of their names. I had, 50 to 70. It's really hard to learn 75 names. But I learned their names and we created really cool environments. We did active learning in the classroom and I created just kind of crazy experiments for them, really cool case studies and things like that. It was just, I wanted them to like coming there. and being there. And a lot of professors have a hard time with attendance. And I didn't even take attendance, and I'd always have 80%. That's actually a really good number for engineering. I know you're like 80%. I was like, that's really good for engineering college students. So I would have 80% of my students show up to class, and without punishments. Really got into no punishments for things. So I don't know if when the spark of learning came alive, I guess in a way it was when I was trying to spark other people's love of learning. And then I was really motivated to do that intrinsically because I wanted them to love it. And then now with my kids, gosh, that's the most interesting thing I've ever had to do is try to teach my children. And I've learned so much. Not just about learning, because I learned a lot of that before, but just about all the things I'm teaching her. I hadn't read all these classics. Now I'm like, oh, now I need to understand classic literature. And I didn't know history. I'm learning so much about history. My husband and I were having a debate. They're like, is Mary Scott's, is that the one that was after Henry Tudor? And I was like, no, it's a different one. That's, so we were just doing that this morning. And the kids were arguing with us about it. And I'm like, what's happening? My whole life is so different. I love this.
That's amazing. I also want to talk about how you made self-paced learning and mastery-based learning work in a classroom of 50 to 100 kids, because that defies the logic of how a classroom of 50 to 100 kids is supposed to work. How did this work in practice?
So the way I did, mastery-based learning, I know your audience probably knows it pretty well, but the idea that you can take, and I would tell the students, I was like, I don't care when you learn this. I just learn that you learn it by the end of the semester. And for those students who were struggling to get things done, I would always go to bat for them for the university. Usually the university will give them a little bit of grace period. Of course, I don't say that up front because I'm not supposed to. But all the students that were struggling at the end, I would always give extensions to help them get there. So we would lay out all of the programs, and I basically have their exams that were open, and they could take the same exam multiple times. And I tried this multiple ways. At one point, I tried it so that I gave them slightly different exams of the same types of questions that didn't work quite as well. So they basically had the same exam, and they had to it was open indefinitely. And you would think, now everyone thought, they're like, well, yeah, they'll all just take that till they get A's. Interestingly, they don't. They don't do that. So now some of them do, but okay. But most of them, usually you'll take, the students who are super motivated, they will take it a maximum of 3 times. And those are the students that are trying to get 99% or 100. The other students will usually take it about twice. It's almost, sometimes they'll only just take it once if they get the grade that they like off the first bat. But I think that them knowing that they had the opportunity, and I would actually actively tell them, I'm like, look, the first exam was so for students, if you think about a classroom, every single time they walk into a classroom, it's kind of this, it's new. They don't know what kind of questions I ask. I would say, take it the first time, just see what it's like. You know what kind of questions they ask, and then study for it and take it again. They can't memorize all. They couldn't take screen. It was in a lockdown browser, so they couldn't they probably could have cheated really hard if they wanted to, but they didn't. Most of the students didn't, and so they would work really hard at that. And so I would allow them to have multiple attempts at their grades. With the laboratory experience, so I actually started in the lab. So we had a lab set. And at the beginning, I'd have kind of 3. Regimented is not the right. They were more regimented, but they still got to vote. They still got to vote on we had a group hypothesis as a whole lab. They still got to vote on some of the things. And then the last lab, they would have a small group, and they could kind of come up with whatever they want. During COVID, I was just we're just going to do the one that you want to do the whole time, because I was just this is too messy, and they're 80% of them are online. I was just do whatever you I'm going to help you craft a cool hypothesis, but you can study almost anything within bounds. And so we would have them do that. But the point was with the lab reports. So the lab reports, you have to keep in mind, every student is a little bit different because they're all doing slightly different projects. But when they would submit it, they'd submit the introduction the first time, and they would get graded, they could redo it. So then when they submitted the next time, they'd submit the methods. And so then we would regrade the intro, and then they would get a grade on the methods. So everything that they did, they got, because that was so time intensive, they only really got, with the introduction, I guess they kind of got to get regraded a couple of times. But the last discussion, they only got to regrade it once. But everything that they had in my classroom, they got to get feedback on, and then get another grade. And I think it's so important. I think so many times, one of the problems with you take a test and then you got an 80% on it and you get to move on to the next thing. Well, you missed 20%. Did you miss that because you didn't understand it? Well, then like now your foundation is really weak, and now you're moving on to the next thing. You haven't mastered the thing before. So I think it's so important that students be given the chance to actually rise and learn and go forth. So in terms of with the big classroom like that, I had help. We had because it's ASU, we had undergraduate TAs as well as a master's level student who would help. And I had kind of created a pipeline of students. So and I didn't choose them based on grades. I chose them based on interests. I'd say, who's really interested in this class and wants to come and help me teach it again the next time. And basically whoever was most excited, they got to come and do it. It didn't matter if they got A's or B's or what, and it was usually the A students, but they got to come. And then they would learn and they would help teach. And then the next time they would be the ones who were helping grade. But so they'd already taught the class. They'd taken it and they taught it, and then they were helping me grade. And then they were learning a lot because I was teaching them how to grade. And then the exams, we used a lot of technology to help me with that. But it is possible. It's harder to let students make their own choices, but it's so much better. Students love these. I can't tell you how much fun these kids, like you would come into the lab and they would be like laughing and playing in the lab. And like they almost always, there's some like group of gentlemen that was almost always like they was always like doing some sort of thing with exercise. And like they'd be going out, we were next to this track, and they would like be running around the track and coming back and like putting on all this equipment and be like, okay, now do squats. And like, they were just doing all these cool things. And they were just having so much fun. It was just, and in fact, actually 2 years actually in a row, because after I started doing the labs, the students from the prior year, because you had to recruit subjects, because you had to take 10 subjects, I think. And they would recruit from either within the classroom, but lots of them would bring their friends in. So then we had friends coming into the class, and a lot of them would bring the former students. So my former students from the year before, they're like, we're so excited to come back and do the lab again. Like, so they loved it. Like, it's just, you can do that. And you can, if it's active, if it's, personalized to them, if it's, meaningful to them, kids will get excited about stuff, even college students.
I also want to talk about you coming to the decision to quit your job to be a homeschooling mom, because this is something that I think a lot of people dismiss outright. They just think we could never do that. Or they get very scared of the implications of both the logistical implications of, well, we're going to lose one of our two incomes and we're going to have to tighten things up and it's going to be hard and I don't know how we're going to make this work. But also on the career side, so much of our lives is spent being told that our career is such a core part of who we are. It's how we're affecting the world. It's how we're building our reputation. It's what we attach our self-esteem to. And walking away from that can be really hard. I had a friend who got married and her husband was very successful and she was working a job that she didn't particularly like. She was just doing it to pay the bills, and they got married and her husband said, you can quit if you want. Like, your job isn't really affecting us that much. I would be just as happy if you were pouring your energy into setting up our home and making dinner and, prepare, like tending to our social network and preparing for us to build a family. And so she quit her job. But at social events, it was always hard to answer the question. People be like, oh, so what do you do? And no one was expecting to hear, I'm just a housewife right now. Like, it almost felt like people expected some sort of apologetic response. Like, oh, I'm in between jobs, not saying just outright, I got married and quit my job because I didn't really find fulfillment in it and this is more meaningful to me right now. But it's hard to not be attaching your identity to your work, and especially in something like you're doing where people spend, like you said, a decade landing the job and it's not like it's still there when you come back. How did you think about taking the leap, or what were the things that you had to come to terms with in order to feel like you were ready?
Oh, that's a really hard question. I think that everything you said about my identity is wrapped up in being a scientist. And my identity was wrapped up in being a professor. And I will say, as I was making that transition, it was really hard to answer those questions. What is it that you do? Oh, well, right now I'm a professor, but just be a homeschool mom. I think the driving factor for me is my children. And it's like, what am I going to regret most? Am I going to regret losing the career? And at the time, now I can definitively tell you I don't regret it. But as I was making the transition, it's like, well, what am I going to regret most? Like not finishing this career out, or knowing what I have with my children now, not doing it properly, not giving it everything I had. So like if my kids end up not having everything they need, or like we talked about, feel that feeling uncertainty about that. If I feel like I didn't give it everything I had, I would always regret that. Or to think that, that they decided to go back to school because I wasn't giving them everything they needed. I just feel like there's no bigger regrets. And I regret putting them in daycare. I regret being away from them as much as I was. And that's a deep, deep and painful. Because, and I don't want to start like a whole daycare conversation. I think that, people should make the right decision for them. It harmed my children. It harmed my oldest child. And I know that now, and I can talk about that. And that's painful. And so I think that when it came down to, it's like, well, what is my purpose? I know that I was helping at the university. I knew that I was doing really important things. I'm very sad that I don't get to have the kind of influence I was having on the students. I just, to get to talk to them about things and stuff like that. I'm sad and I miss that. But but my purpose is my children. Like, they're my number one. This is my family, and they have to be it. And so I think that's where my focus was, and that's what was a driving factor. And I think, and I will say we are very lucky because we waited for me to resign to when my husband was able to manipulate his job so he didn't fully replace. But we didn't have to go, because I was bringing in almost 50% of what we made. So we were going to have to cut. Like, it wasn't reasonable for me to just quit outright. So it took longer than we really wanted it to. But he decided to take on, something like taking, and I'm so grateful that he was willing to do that. And I also am grateful we were always on the same page. Like, we felt really good about that. I know there's so many people that don't have that with homeschooling, but we both saw how huge of a difference it made for our children. And so we were on the same page about that. So we were lucky from that perspective, from the financial perspective. And then honestly, I think I also am lucky because I had this online voice, which was not on purpose. I didn't seek out to do that. I will always say that this new kind of thing that I'm doing chose me. I didn't choose it. But I think that's, now people, someone's like, you're a homeschool influencer. I'm like, baby. Like, I don't think I'm an influencer, but I hope that people tell me that I inspire them to do good things with their kids. I hope that that's true. I wish that for other people. I wish that people would feel empowered to quit their jobs if they want to, or to do something different with their kids. It doesn't have to be homeschooling. For the record, I think that there's so many wonderful ways to educate children, and I think just infinite ways to educate children. So I just want people to feel empowered to do something to interact with their kids and do better. So at the end, it's just about my kids.
If someone were to ask you for advice in broad brush strokes, if they were in the position maybe that you were a couple of years ago, where they knew they wanted something other than traditional institutional school for their kids, and they were thinking about homeschooling, but they just didn't think it was logistically possible, but they hear a story like this, they're like, oh, maybe it is. Maybe there is actually a way to make this work. But they have concerns about either giving up the income of their job, or giving up the career mobility, or the path that they fought so hard to be on. Do you have advice of how to think about that problem, or what you wish you had known maybe a couple years prior about what the process could look like and what was possible for you?
I think the big thing is I do think it's possible to homeschool and work or work part-time, like if finances are a big thing. I mean, I did it for 3 years. It was hard. It was possible. I will say what inspired me was I read a blog of a woman who was a single mom homeschooling. And I'm like, well, if she can do it, I've got a partner. like surely I can be able to pull this off if this woman is making it work. So I was like, okay, well, we can do this. I will say one of the big reasons I had a lot of control over my schedule. Then I have a lot more control over my schedule than most. But it still wasn't infinite control. I think that if you can have a job or transition to a job that you do have more control or is in odd hours. I know someone online who works nights effectively. I don't know how she manages that. Like, I feel like I would need a little bit more sleep, but she homeschools and then works like kind of late afternoon into the later parts of the night. And her kids are older, so they can do a lot of some of the early stuff on their own. And then she works with them later. So I think that there's ways to do that. Also, I don't think people know that there's so many there's so many micro schools or like Kai Pods. You can do Tide Pods twice a week. And I know I'm kind of, we live in Arizona. And so we have Eagle Ridge, which is like basically in our neighborhood, which is like a public school, but it's just for homeschoolers. And so you can send them 2 days a week or 3 days a week. And lots of people do that. So there's or you can get together with other homeschool parents and like trade out. I think that you don't have to do this by yourself. And you don't have to 100% quit your job. I think that you need to have a flexible job. And I will say, one of the things I'm telling my children, and I tell them, I was like, if you decide to homeschool your kids, and I would say if, because I will not force it on them, but I say, you need to be thinking about a job that you can come in and out of, that you can take a little bit back on, or that you have a lot of flexibility in. And I wish someone had told me that. Like, it's not just about building your career, but making sure you have that flexible career so that you can come in and out of it. There are jobs that are like that, even in very traditional jobs, like a nurse, there was a woman down the street that she got a job as a nurse. Like, she waited until her kids were all of her kids were in school, and then she went and got a job, as a nurse. But then she can work 2 days a week. She can work 5 days a week. She can work, so she can back off. She can go more. She can take time off. Her nursing degree doesn't go away. She just goes right back in. So there's there's lots of alternative kind of style jobs that a lot of people like. But I think there are so many ways to make it work. Form a group, form a pod, do part-time. I think it's absolutely possible to do that if you aren't financially not in a position where you can just 100% step back. So I think there's so much out there. Don't give up.
What were the biggest things when you were working and homeschooling? What were the biggest things that you did to make it work? Because I think a lot of people, that is the solution that they come to, at least in the short term. That's the only way that makes it possible. What worked for you when you were doing that allowed you to sustain that for multiple years?
The biggest thing is we had a homeschool block. So I blocked the mornings, and it's like, this is homeschool time. And I would stay with them usually until about 1. And then I had, my husband he also had a flex job. So he would work really early. And then somewhere between 1 and 2 o'clock, we would kind of switch. And so he would take over there. So I was lucky I had a partner who was able to do that. So we had a little bit, we both had somewhat flexible jobs. And I think it's unusual. And we were lucky in that way. So that definitely worked. The other thing I would say is that we didn't restrict it to Monday through Friday. So, there's no reason you have to. I do think it's important to have days off for children. But that day off can be Wednesday. Like, it doesn't have to be. I don't think you should be doing school, like hard academic subjects every day. I think everyone needs a break all the time. But there's no reason you can't do school on Saturday or Sunday. And you go to the pool afterwards or whatever that people do on the weekends, right? So I think that was the big thing for us. I did a lot of. They were also younger, and to be honest, K through 2, I mean, you can learn almost everything you need with games and stuff. I mean, you need to be conscientious about those games, but you can learn those. And most K through 2, like, they just, like, the academics take like 20 minutes. Like, it's just so, like, you're like, when they're learning to read, like, you're just like, they're not like, you're teaching them the letter sounds, and you're reading a couple Bob books, and like, that was good for that day. Like, you need to do it consistently. You can't just like, willy-nilly do it. But like a lot of times they'd be like, okay, well, now what am I going to, like, we've got 4 hours. Like, what are we going to do now? And it was like, oh, let's do some science, or let's do some, whatever else. So I think there's parts of being, when they're younger, it's harder in other ways. Like, they're a lot, and you can't like leave them alone to get into their own stuff and go work in the other room. You can't do that. But their academics require a lot less of you, and time-wise. And then we got all the crates, like the Kiwi crates and the Crunch Labs, and we have all of those things that were coming in. And of course, we're in ESA states, so those get reimbursed. So we'd have like cool projects for them in the afternoons, or even in the late morning. So I think when they're younger, you don't. Now, as they're getting older, it's requiring, and that was part of it for me. As they're getting older, I was like, I need to give more and more of my time. It's counterintuitive because they are more independent, but their work is longer and harder. And so I also have to kind of come along with them. So like what we're doing in science is more, and like the way I want to teach it is not, it's like, we're going to do an experiment. It's not like you do an experiment over in the corner by yourself. It's like, we're all going to do an experiment, So it takes more and more of my time to do it right, I think, for me anyway. So I would just say that, but they are, as they get older, they do have more independent time. So I do think that you can, if you still need to work, you can come. There's lots of things that my kids can do completely independently, and then I can check the work and refocus on that. There's also so many great online programs, lots of really good ones that are out there. So, and I don't think that's really great for, make your own decisions. It was not a good fit for my kids when they were tiny, but my 5th grader could handle having an online program for math. And she already is watching like 10-minute videos for her math and things like that. So, and then she does a lot of the work offline. So you're just having to kind of check and then help with that. So there are a lot of things that they can do independently if you need them to be more independent as they get older.
You're working on building resources for parents to support them in the homeschooling journey, and also not in the homeschooling journey, for parents who are doing different types of alternative schools or their kids are still in public school. You're not just doing this with your kids, but creating resources and support structures to help other parents on the same journey of helping their kids love learning and be intrinsically motivated and curious to learn new things, and to expose them to the ideas and the classics and the rigorous content that's going to help them train their minds and become strong thinkers and have a strong foundation for the creative work and the self-discovery and the life path planning that they're going to do as their lives evolve. I'd love to take a little bit of time to just plug all of the things that you're doing, because they're awesome. I know I've already said this like 4 times in this interview, but your Twitter is amazing. It's a must follow. Your content is great. But that's not the only thing that you're doing. If people love this conversation, and I imagine that many people did, where else can they find you, and what else are you working on?
So I have a website. It's called clarified.life. And Clarified, it's with the ED capitalized, so it's about education. And I find that there's so many people out there talking about all of these amazing things, and what your life could look like. Like on Instagram, you're like watching all the people on these beautiful lives, but like there's so few people that are talking, this is how you do that. Like this is like day to day what that looks like. And so I'm trying really hard to distill down like what I experience in a classroom versus what I'm doing with my kids. How do you have interactions with your children? How do you how do you create joyful learning? What are the tenets of that? It needs to be active. It needs to be meaningful. It needs to be personalized. What does that mean? How do you create that with kids? So that's, I've got this, like I said, I miss teaching, other people and other groups. I love teaching my kids. I don't miss that. That's fantastic. But I hope to help other people, take charge of their world. So I've just recently, I actually just recorded my first workshop. So I'm starting to do workshops with that as well now, instead of just writing, because I think sometimes you just need to hear it. And I actually started recording conversations that I have with my children, because I think people don't recognize, like, what is this play? Like, okay, here's how you do a Socratic dialogue. Michael Strong also does this, where he has conversations with older kids. And I'm like, this is what that looks like with a 10-year-old or a 7-year-old. And so I'm hoping to help people really take charge of their kids' education, and whatever that looks like. If your kid's in school full time, you can still do really magical things with them at home. You can still take them on virtual field trips to beautiful museums or ancient structures. You can still read them the story of the world when they're at home. So you're giving them a framework for history when they're there. You could still do amazing, cool science experiments with them at home. You could still read classics to them at home if they're not getting them at school. And so there's still all of these different ways that you can, even if it's not for you to take your kids out, there's lots of ways to just ignite that love of learning for your kids. And I think if you can keep it going enough at home, sometimes even in the right school environment, they'll be okay. So
where would you send people next in terms of links? If they're listening to this or they want to go somewhere else immediately, where would you send them first? Is Twitter the best place as a hub for everything else that you're doing, or is there somewhere else?
Either one is great. So at Hippie Mom PhD, and the Hippie is HIPPY, which that was my anonymous account, and then and so we're just gonna keep the name. So at Hippie Mom PhD on Twitter, and then clarify.life on the web. Those are my two places.
Amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. It was such a delight to finally have you on the show.
Thank you so much. It was so wonderful to get to meet you in person.
We'll talk more soon. All right, my friends, that is a wrap for today. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope that you found this valuable. Please leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. Please like the video on YouTube. And please don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you listen to make sure that you don't miss next week's episode. Thank you so much, friends. I will see you next week.